Well, thank you all so much for joining us. Tonight, author Victoria Gilbert will discuss her new cozy mystery novel, Schooled in Murder, a Campus Sleuth Mystery, in this latest installment of Author Hour in Massachusetts. A little bit about Victoria. Raised in a historic small town at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains, Victoria Gilbert turned her early obsession with books into a dual career as an author and as a librarian. Now retired after over 30 years in the library field, she's worked as a research librarian and a university library director. Victoria writes the Blue Ridge Library Mystery Series, the Booklovers B&B Mystery Series, and the Hunter and Clewe Traditional Mystery Series, all from Crooked Lane Books. She's a member of Mystery Writers of America, Sisters in Crime, and International Thriller Writers. She is a Virginia native, but now lives in North Carolina. And tonight she's going to talk about all sorts of things, including all of her series, but in particular, we're going to focus on her new book, Schooled in Murder. I'm going to give you a brief synopsis just to whet your appetite, and then we'll get to the good stuff here. So a mystery writer must solve a real murder case before an innocent girl is condemned in this series debut from acclaimed author Victoria Gilbert, perfect for fans of Ellery Adams and Lorna Barrett. Jennifer Jen Dalton is an author and educator at Clarion University in Virginia. She loves her job, but some of her petty coworkers look down on her for writing genre fiction. As members of the English department, they wish to encourage students to pursue higher literary aspirations. When a humiliating confrontation between an uppity professor and one of Jen's students, Mia, escalates, no one thinks much of it until his dead body is found along with evidence incriminating Mia. Jen knows Mia couldn't have killed him, but Mia's suspicious disappearance might as well have been a proclamation of guilt. With the sleuthing skills Jen has acquired writing murder mysteries, she's determined to solve the case and clear Mia's name. Along with the help of her fellow sleuthers, Christine Kubiak, a cafeteria manager, Zachary Flynn, the charming but annoying campus psychologist, and Brianna Rowley, a librarian, there's always a librarian, Jen must catch the real killer before there's another murder on the books. Folks, I am excited. And folks, I have delved into this book. It is excellent. So with all that said, please give me a big virtual round of applause to Victoria for joining us here tonight. And Victoria, thanks so much for being here.
You're quite welcome.
So Victoria,
I enjoyed it.
So Victoria, I'd like to know the Victoria Gilbert origin story. So tell us, how did you get involved in writing?
Well, I always loved to write from the time I learned to read and write, but it was sort of a hobby or something I just did to express myself. And I wrote a lot of little short stories and poems and all the things you write when you're a teenager. And I always said I was going to write a book, and I would start things and it didn't go anywhere. And then I got really busy with my other career. And so, and family and other things that happen in life. But then one day, and this was when I was, I think, about 56, yeah. I just was thinking, and I thought I always swore that I would write at least one book. I would complete it. I didn't even care about publishing it. I just wanted to know that I had written one, I had completed it. And so I said, I'm going to do that. And I did. And that book and its sequel are sitting in a drawer. They were not ever published. But when I learned that I could write a book, that I could do the process, I started getting more involved with online communities, a lot of helpful communities that have discussion groups, and you meet other authors, and also a book club in my area and some writing groups. And eventually I acquired an agent and a book deal, and this was for a different genre. This was young adult fantasy, and I also wrote young adult sci-fi, and I had a couple books published by a small publisher. But then that publisher things weren't going well. So Not to speak ill of anyone, but and so then I had to change agents too, because the agent I had left the business, and fortunately her boss, who owns the company, said she was keeping me. And we had several long talks, and I said, "Oh, I want to switch genres, but I'm not really sure to what. I don't know what I want to do." And she said, "Well, what do you like to read?" And I said, "Well, one thing I really like to read is mysteries." So obviously she said, "Why don't you write a mystery?" And so I did. And I discovered, which is one of those things that you don't know until you try, that really is my genre. I wrote A Murder for the Books, which is the first book in the Blue Ridge Library Mystery Series. And I set it in the area where I grew up. It's the town is fictional, but it's based on towns I knew in Northern Virginia at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It's Loudoun County, if anybody knows that. And so I was really interested in creating that particular world because it was something I knew I could draw on the history and the culture of that area. And so I wrote that book, and my agent sent it out, and within a week we had like several offers. So then I realized, well, this must be it. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And we got a 3-book deal on that. So that started the mysteries. And I that was from Crooked Lane Books, who I still work with. All my books, mystery books, are published by them. And so now, since then, that book, the first mystery book, came out in 2017, December. And I think, I always forget how many there are. 14. I don't know. I have to add them up in my head, but I've written quite a few others and had them published since that time. But I just always want to tell people I was 58 when my first book was published, and now I have 4 series. So, if you're thinking, well, it's too late for me to do something like that, it isn't. It's never too late to do something that you want to try to do.
Yeah, I think that's an inspiration. That's words to live by right there. So Victoria, before we talk about each of your series and then your newest book, could we have you define for us what is meant by a cozy mystery?
Well, cozy mystery, sometimes also called a traditional mystery, it actually grew out of, if you think about things like Agatha Christie and some of the really golden age, they call it, mystery writers, where the mysteries, they can be a little dark sometimes, but there's no graphic violence, there's no graphic sex, there's no, not a lot of bad language. And so it's a story that really relies more on the characters, the setting, and the puzzle to be solved, and the murder puzzle, or it doesn't have to be a murder even. It could be another kind of crime. But so cozies, some of them are really funny. There's a whole range. That's the thing that's interesting about cozies, is that people think they're one thing, but they're really not. You really fall under that umbrella as long as you stick by those rules of not having graphic anything. Is what I always say. And so you've got on one hand some really funny, lighthearted. There's even fantasy sort of based ones, or things that have witches, or that kind of paranormal thing. And then you go along the spectrum, and some of them are a lot more serious. Mine are sort of tend toward the more serious end. I mean, there is some humor in them, but they're not really what I would call a humorous. I wouldn't put them in that category for an award or anything, because there's a lot of people funnier than I am. But,
no, you're being modest though. So your first series, and the series you're probably the series you are best known for, the Blue Ridge Library Mystery Series. So could you? I believe you've published 8 books in this series. I think the 9th book is coming out this summer. So could you give us a brief, 3-minute synopsis of the Blue Ridge Library Mystery Series and Amy Weber? Let us know about Amy.
Amy Weber. Well, first of all, as I said, I was a librarian. And so I decided to write about a librarian because I felt like, not just because I know that world, but also because there's so many misconceptions about libraries and librarians, and I wanted to create a more realistic portrayal. So Amy is younger. She's when the first book starts, she's like 32 or 3, something like that. And then the books follow along, and she gets older as the books go along because time passes. But she had been working at a university, and then something happened where she had a big embarrassment with her boyfriend and whatnot. So she decided to go to work at the public library in her family town of Taylorsford, Virginia. And that is really based on towns I knew growing up. It's not a real town, but it's very similar to many real towns in the area where I grew up. So she takes over as library director for this small public library. And she has a best friend that she's known for many years named Sunshine Fields. And they call her Sunny. And Sunny is a fun character because her grandparents were hippies. And her mother kind of ran off and left her with her grandparents. But she sort of has that flower child aspect to her. And now the grandparents have an organic farm. So it's, still sort of that hippie vibe going on. But she's a main character throughout the series too, along with Aunt Lydia, who is Amy's aunt, her mother's sister. And she's a very aristocratic lady who is no nonsense. And she lives in a Victorian home. And Amy lives with her because she doesn't get paid that much. I mean, let's face it, librarians don't get paid that much most of the time. And so she's rooming with her aunt in the town to start with. And then as the book progresses, I don't like to give away too much about things and people are going to start the series, but she meets several different people. One who's very important is Richard Muir, who is a contemporary dancer and choreographer, and he's moved into the house next to hers because he inherited it from a relative. And let's just say they end up becoming very closely acquainted.
Yeah.
So there's all these different people that come into the story, and I carry those throughout the 8 books. There's going to be 9, as you said. A lot of the mysteries revolve around things that also tie back into the history of the people or the town. So the first book is actually related to Amy's family. There's a whole mystery that's related to her family. So she's digging back to find out, the truth behind some things that have been glossed over in the family history.
So your second series, the Book Lovers B&B series, okay? It would be an all-time dream for me to inherit a literary-themed bed and breakfast, okay? So can you talk a bit about the 3 books in this series? I'm also curious if this series is on a hiatus, or are we coming back with a 4th book? I want the inside scoop on that.
In that book, Charlotte, who's Reed, is the main character, and she's in her 40s, early 40s. And she lost her husband very tragically, but then she inherited from her great aunt a very old home in Beaufort, North Carolina, which is a real place. And it's a seaside. It's not actually on the ocean. It's on a bay in a harbor off the ocean, but it's very close to Atlantic Beach and that whole area, and south of Nag's Head and some of those areas people might have heard of. And Beaufort is wonderful because it's a beautiful old town, and they have houses, 1700s, homes from the 1700s. They have so much history. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to set it there. And also because we have a timeshare at Atlantic Beach, and so we visit Beaufort every year. So I do know Beaufort to a certain extent. I've walked the streets. I've even talked to the police captain there. And so this series is Charlotte taking over this bed and breakfast, which actually hosts literary events. And there's a beautiful library there that her great aunt collected, a personal library. And so course, murder happens, and she has to get involved. And she gets involved and brings in her neighbor, who's like an older lady in her 70s. And she seems like, a real savvy sort of older lady. But what you find out later is that her background is quite unusual. And she has a lot more skills in sleuthing and crime solving than you would think. And so the two of them are major characters throughout the three books, and they kind of work together to solve a couple of murders. And that one is ended. I wrote the third book in a way that it could be ended, mainly because writing 4 series at a time would be impossible. It's really difficult to juggle that many series. And also for the publisher, you can only put them out. They have their whole publishing year where they have to plan. And so, I might have 2 books coming out a year, but, I can't have more than that, all these books coming out.
Yeah.
So.
No, I think that's completely understandable. I was sort of teasing you about being on a hiatus there, because I know we're going to talk about your third series now, which I believe has a book coming out next year. And that is, and I may be mispronouncing the character's last name, but Hunter and Clewe.
Clewe.
How am I
It's spelled it's like Cloue, Clewe, but that's the last name. Clewe is spelled differently.
Yeah. And
Hunter and the Clewe. Yeah.
And so this one is also set in North Carolina, and also features a librarian. Why don't you tell us about this series?
Well, this series features Jane Hunter, who's in her early 60s. And she was forced to retire a little early from her job at a university library, where she was a cataloger, mainly. She did some other things too, but mainly she focused on cataloging books. And she wasn't ready to retire because she wasn't wealthy, didn't have a lot of money, and she didn't want to take Social Security, too early. So she found a job cataloging in the collections of a wealthy collector who happened to be a young man, fairly young man in his 30s, named Cameron Clewe. And he owns a big estate outside of, it's in the Winston-Salem, Greensboro area. If people know that area, the Piedmont Triad. And this estate was something he inherited. He inherited businesses that he runs from there. But the thing about Cam is that he is, I guess best way to describe him would be neurodivergent. He has issues, he has social issues. He has OCD and anxiety, and he's a little bit agoraphobic. Doesn't like to leave his house and estate that much. So despite being really, handsome young man with lots of money, he really has his social issues that he has to deal with. And that's where Jane comes in, because Jane comes in and, there's no romance between them. Please don't think there is, but it's more like, older sister or motherly kind of thing. But she comes in and she's no nonsense, and she really can work with him. So when they start getting involved in solving murders, it's kind of a, Sherlock Watson thing there. But they find that they work together well, because he can figure out all the puzzles. He's sort of good at all that, finding the clues and putting the puzzle together. And she's good at the social interaction and interviewing people and, bringing back the information and so forth. So they become a team, and they decide, because he has lots of money, that they don't really charge people for this. They help people out who have like cold cases or who are unfairly accused and that sort of thing. So there's 2 books out now. The last one, Killer Clue, came out in September, this past September, and I'm currently writing the 3rd book, which will come out in the spring of 2026.
Yeah, next year. Excellent. Wonderful. Looking forward to that. And then finally, that brings us to the Campus Sleuth Mystery series, which you've just launched this week. Yeah, and so book number 1, Schooled in Murder. So, and I did read the synopsis at the start, but why don't you tell us a bit about this series and the fact that it's a companion series to the Blue Ridge Library Mystery Series? What do you mean by companion series?
Well, when I was thinking about writing this book, I was thinking, I worked at a university for many years, 25 years. I was a university library director at a small university. It was an arts, visual and performing arts-based university, which is actually my background. I have a theater degree and I worked in design work. And before I went to library school. And I've always worked, I had art history minor and all this. So I like to bring that in, and you'll see it in my books, all of the performing and visual arts references. But also I thought it would be fun to set something at a university because I worked at a small university for so many years. And believe me, there's lots of stuff going on in universities that lends itself to criminal activity.
I don't doubt it.
A lot of people want to kill each other, but there's a lot of politics and jockey for position and all that sort of thing, because it's very rough, to try to get tenure or to try to become a professor. It's a tough thing that you're fighting against a lot of other people. You're competing. So I thought it would be a good place to have that kind of, tension and something happening. And I felt like I knew libraries, the sense of, because I was an administrator, I dealt with a lot of that aspect of it at the university level. And I wanted to sort of bring in that knowledge that I had about life on the university campus for the staff and so forth. Yeah.
So Victoria, so as you said, you were a librarian for a few decades. I know that you gave a presentation to Sisters in Crime about how libraries and librarians are portrayed in literature and how there's a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. I'm just curious if you wanted to make any commentary on how libraries and librarians are sometimes portrayed, perhaps could be portrayed better in literature.
Yeah, not just literature, but media is really bad about it too, because I can't tell you how many times I've seen TV shows or commercials where they still have a card catalog library, which nobody has those anymore. I mean, they might have them in the back, but they don't have them out front. And then, that whole hushing and shushing and the librarians being these meek, reserved people who wear pearls and, I've met librarians of every kind, every background, men too, because a lot of times you never see that, which is silly because there's a lot of male librarians. And the librarian in School for Murder, she has tattoos, which it's not like librarians have tattoos. And so, I wanted to show that it's not this sort of ivory tower depiction of libraries, because actually libraries are very social places, and people are getting together, especially these days, students, if it's a university or college or high school, they have to work on group projects a lot. So you don't have this sort of hushed, thing where somebody's just hiding in the background reading books, but it's and also for public libraries, they're really the center of a lot of communities where it's the only place that a lot of people can go to use a computer or to get online, and you have to get online to find a job. So where do you go? They have literacy classes and they teach English as a second language, or they bring people in to teach English as a second language. children's programs. So, libraries are so varied and important to communities. And I like to show that in the books and talk about all the different things that they do and offer.
So Victoria, three of your books feature librarians as protagonists, and you had mentioned earlier you like to write what you know, and so a lot of your settings and your plots and your characters involve things that you've experienced in your life, whether it's professionally or personally, your hobbies and interests in the arts and whatnot. So I wonder if you could speak to, have you used any real life situations in your plots? Are there any characters in your stories that maybe are based on people in your real life?
The characters are not. Of course, you observe people and you draw things in to create characters, but I've never based a character specifically on a person that I've known. And I try very hard not to be what they call a self-insert, which is where the author is sort of like putting themselves in the book. And I try to make my characters different from me in certain ways so that I avoid that. And also, as far as settings, things I know, I don't think I could write something if I had never been to a place. I know some people do that very well, but I would feel like I'd have to visit at least. Because to me, there's a lot of sensory things, like how does the air quality feel? What's the smells in the air, the scents, and things like that. And that is important because I like to bring that into my writing. And as far as situations, yeah, I have used some funny things. When I first was a librarian, my first job, and you're going to think this is great, but it was good, but it wasn't what you're thinking. I worked at New York Public Library at Lincoln Center, but I didn't work in the research library. I worked downstairs where anyone can walk in. And they had collections of mainly focused on the performing arts. And we had it's New York. Anybody can walk in. So I had quite an education when I first went to work, dealing with all kinds of patrons. And there's a couple depictions of patrons in some of my books that it's not exactly the same, but they were inspired by patrons I ran across, mostly in New York. And then on the university, the Schooled in Murder, there's some situations that, were very common in the university setting, like her going to a meeting. There's one scene where she's in a meeting, and that was I had to put that in there because you sit in meetings and half the people are, paying attention, half aren't. And you have to go to all these training sessions and get signed off that, you went to a training session. And I don't think people think about that much when they think about, university life, but it's really part of it.
So Victoria,
so I did. Yeah.
Oh, sorry to cut you off there, but so before we transition to questions about your writing process, which I'm fascinated on, I always love to ask questions around the writing process. I did want to ask you. So we've described the four series. I think we've sufficiently whet the appetite of the audience, but I'm curious. Who could you give us a couple of other authors, a couple of other cozy mystery authors that maybe write similarly to you? If you like this author, then you're likely to like Victoria Gilbert. Can you think of any read-alikes, any similar authors to compare yourself to?
That's always hard for me because there's so many people who are good, and I think it's hard for me outside to say, oh, I'm like this. But there's an author with my publisher, M.E. Hilliard, who writes about librarians and libraries. And her books have a similar tone, I think, to mine. If you want to talk about influences, somebody who influenced me a lot, although this was way back when I was reading as a young person, was Mary Stewart, because a lot of people know her only from the Crystal Cave in that series, but she wrote a lot of romantic suspense and mysteries. And I read everything first. I think I was influenced, and I can see it kind of in some of my writing, the influence of the tone and style a little bit in my books. Because my books are, I would say, they're not real heavy, but they have some darker themes and aspects and more emotional themes. Because they do deal with certain things that a lot of cozies don't want to get into, like drug dealing and stuff from the past that was like, people's backgrounds. But that's just life. And to me, when you're writing about murder, you can't make it too fun. I mean, it can't be a joyride the whole way. So
yeah. So I think I know this. I think I read that you are a plotter and not a pantser. But Laura has a great question. She wants to know, do you know who did it from the beginning, or do you find out as you write?
They're both. When I first started writing, I really knew for my first books, I was more set in it, like an outline that was really set. But then what I discovered was I would be writing and I would be following. I always did an outline, but I'd be following the outline, and then I'd realize through the writing process that maybe it would be better to do something different. It didn't feel right. The way that I'd done the outline, it didn't feel like it was moving in the right direction. So I will change things. And I have changed killers from the beginning, because it would just occur to me that, I have a lot of suspects who could possibly have done it. So there are things that, could point to them. And then I think sometimes one character or another has a better motive, or, it makes more sense. So I have changed them about halfway through sometimes.
And anything else? So Laura also asks, anything else you can divulge about your writing process?
Well, I tend to plan out, like, I'll look at when my due dates are. You can imagine, I've been writing 2 books a year, or a little more than 2 books a year in some cases. So I have to be very diligent about my time. I am retired, but not really, because I'm writing full time. So I will plot out on a calendar, actually, and it's not so much really I have to reach this word count by this date, but it's more a general sense of where I should be on different dates, times to get the book done.
What does a normal day look like for you, Victoria?
Well, I usually write between 10 to 3. And it really depends on where I am in the process. But I can write a book in 2 or 3 months. But you have to have other time for thinking and research, because I do research, even though I'm writing about things I know, I don't know enough. In one of the Blue Ridge books, they talk a lot about art theft, and it gets into the whole thing with the Nazis had stolen a lot of art, and that plays in as a historical background. And so I had to do research on that to make sure I was not just pulling things out of thin air. And I found out some interesting facts, like that a lot of experts believe 40% of all the artwork in museums is fake. It's forged, or, reproductions. And it's a really big thing. I had no idea how huge the fake art situation was, but forgeries and selling off things that they shouldn't be selling from, stolen objects and so forth. So when I get into things like that, I've got to do research. And
so
I do.
There's the research and the planning, right? Research and the planning. Then there's the writing.
Writing.
Tell us about the editing, Victoria.
There's the revision, yes.
Yeah.
Well, I do a revision before I hand it over to my editor. And then she gets it. I have a really good editor, Faith Black Ross, who is at Crooked Lane. And we work together on all my books. And she gives me then the edit notes and all the things she wants me to look at, change, improve, maybe add something. There's just a lot of things that, when you get it back, then you have to do that work, which I don't mind, but it is another level of work, because sometimes, there's an issue in the book where you really have to go through the whole book and fix things to make it work. And after that, it goes to the copy editor, and I get those notes back. And then there's 2 rounds of what they call page proofs, which was like the book made up like it's going to look. And you have to go through that and catch all the mistakes, or as many as you can. There's always a typo that slips through no matter what you do, no matter how many people have looked at this thing. But so it's a process. It's a real long process of working through to refine everything to make it the best you can.
Yeah. Now,
doing that on one book while I'm writing another one.
Yeah, and so you said that you generally are publishing now 2 a year, or you're writing 2 a year, which I imagine that means you're publishing 2 a year. What is the lead time? So if you write a book, you complete the final draft, you complete all the revisions. Is it a 6-month lead time, a 3-month lead time? How does that work?
Well, I'll just use an example. I'm writing a book now that's due March 3rd. And then it'll be, the editing process takes 2 or 3 months. But the publisher likes to have at least 9 months, 6 to 9 months, because that's their promotional period. And that's the time when they send e-arcs, they call them, electronic arcs, to places for people to do pre-publication reviews, and they send them to trade magazines. And so you really do have to have lead time. And that's why with trade publishing, somebody could get a deal and the book won't be out for 2 years because they have to, finish the book. There has to be editing. There has to be all this. So there is definitely lag time there.
So we have a question from Amanda, Victoria.
Okay.
Amanda asks, does a secondary character ever take on such energy that they unexpectedly hijack the story? And if that happens, do you cut them from the story, or do you follow where it leads?
No, I follow where it leads, because one of the characters in the Blue Ridge series has become very popular with all the readers. That's Kurt Kendrick. He's a man who's in the beginning of the series, he's in his 70s, and in this latest book, the 9th book, he'll be turning 80. But anyway, he's a very interesting character, and I actually added him in because my editor wanted another character in that first book who could be legitimately a suspect. And he just kind of took over in a way that he's become a very major character. He has a very murky background. He's very elegant older man who's tall, and I always said Ted Danson would play him on TV. But he's got his sort of gray qualities, so you're never quite sure whether he still does everything legally or not. But he's become very popular, and I love him too. It's fun to write. It's fun to write him. It's fun to write him with Amy because they have a real interesting relationship. So
you mentioned Ted Danson. Who would play Amy in a
I
TV or
have no
movie?
idea. I'd love to see what people would think, but I don't know. I don't know. I've thought about that. Um, well, one of the things about Amy is that she's supposed to be short and rather plump and curvaceous. She's not stick thin. So every time I see actresses, I'm like, oh, they're too thin. A lot of actresses are too thin, the younger actresses. But so I don't know. If that ever happened, then I'm sure they find someone wonderful. But um,
And
yeah, and
hopefully,
Richard, of course, would have to be a dancer because
yes.
he's a dancer.
And hopefully, they could give you a cameo role. I like it when the author of the series will make an appearance briefly. Blink and you miss it. But
I
that
could
would
be I could be one of the annoying patrons or something.
wouldn't that be funny? Yeah, right. Several of the libraries who partnered tonight for this program, they have writing groups. Wondering if you have any advice to aspiring writers.
Well, I mentioned don't give up and it's not too late. Really, people don't, your age is irrelevant because if your book is good and an agent or a publisher likes it, then you could be really young, you could be really old, it doesn't matter. So don't, get that in your head that you have to be a certain age. You don't. And I would say also to experiment. I mean, one of the things that I discovered, as I mentioned earlier, was that I didn't think I could write mysteries. I mean, I never thought about writing mysteries. And when I started doing it, and then I realized, well, this is what I was good at. So sometimes I think a lot of writers, I'll see them because I've helped and I've mentored other writers. They will get stuck on something like, I've got to make this work. They're writing in a certain genre or style or even age group, like young adult or children, whatever it is. And they're hitting the wall all the time. And I say, why don't you try to do something totally different? Because you never know. You might discover that that's really your genre. And it's fun to experiment. I think it's good to experiment, and that's why I like to have different series, and they're different. They're all different sort of tones and qualities to them. So because if I bore myself, I'm going to bore the readers. So I don't want to do that. But
So you did give us a definition earlier of what a cozy mystery is. Jan wants to know what makes a mystery good. What are some essentials of mysteries in general? What to you makes a good mystery?
well, I think one of the essential qualities is that you have to put in the clues in such a way that at the end, when things are revealed or people discover the truth, that the reader can say, oh yeah, okay, that happened in that scene, or somebody said something, or some small thing happened, and I see it now. It comes together. You can't fake out the reader. Like, there's this phrase, what is it? Deus ex machina. Like from the gods or something. That all of a sudden at the end, all this stuff is spilled out, but there's no clues in the middle of the book to lead anybody anywhere. And on the other hand, you can't, it's a really tricky balance because when you're doing those clues, you don't want to do them so obviously. This is where my editor helps because she'll catch that. She'll go, that's too obvious. And I'll change it. But that people would immediately guess what's going to happen or who the killer was or whatever. And I just don't think you can fake out the reader. You have to be, I always say authentic, but what I mean is trying to create something like, oh, I see that so-and-so is a bestseller. Let me write a book like that. No, because you can't, well, I guess you can fake it and people do, but it long term, and actually writing is a long term sort of a career. It's a long game. I'm just now, after all these books, getting more opportunities like this and other things. people discover you over time. And so you have to be doing something you believe in. I mean, that's just my personal opinion, but I wouldn't want to write something that didn't feel true to me. And so even with mysteries and things like that, I think you have to think about what feels authentic and real people. I'm really big on the characters being well developed and feeling like real people, not some kind of, they're all glamorous and beautiful and perfect and jet setting around or whatever. Because that's not my life. I don't know that life.
So that question was from Jan. Ellen asks, out of your series, do you have a favorite one or a favorite character?
Oof, that's like saying I have a favorite child, right? I only have one child, so it's easy for me, but I'll say favorite cat because I have more cats. Yeah, I can't really say. I mean, the Blue Ridge series has a special place in my heart because it was my first real successful series. And I mean, there's so many books. There's actually going to be 10. 9 comes out, and then I have to write 10. But I love Hunter and Clewe too. And one of the reasons is the main character is closer to my age, and I like writing about an older woman because you don't always see a lot of protagonists who are older. And then just presenting somebody who has these social issues because I actually have that in my family, and so trying to present that character not as a cliche. So I really like Cam, even though he's mixed up, but and then in my new series, the fun banter between the two characters, Jen and Zach. Zach is the psychologist, and they kind of like have this sort of not enemies to lovers, but it's sort of adversarial at first, but kind of banter going on, and that's fun.
I kind of thought that was coming,
Yeah.
as I read on. So that question was from Ellen. Oh, by the way, thoughts on Aunt Lydia? Give us a couple sentences on Aunt Lydia.
Oh, Aunt Lydia. Oh, I love Aunt Lydia because she's like the Southern lady. People like the women I knew in my church when I was a kid who were always elegant and put together and very sweet, but yet tough. And, she lost her husband, and the character lost her husband, who she loved very much at a young age, and has lived alone until Amy moved in with her. And she's very independent, and yet she's very family oriented. And she's just this cool sort of take charge lady who seems like she's a Southern belle, but not really.
So those questions were from Ellen. So Beatrice wants to know, how did you know you were good at writing? When did you first know you were good at writing, Victoria?
I was good at writing from a young age because I used to write these things for school, and my teachers thought they were good. And in high school, I was writing a lot of poetry. I won a couple of competitions, and things like that. I mean, just used writing a lot. When I was using writing for my career, where I had to write reports or write speeches or things like that, it just, just a sense inside that this is okay. And I didn't know if I could be published. I knew I was a good writer. I didn't know if I could be published because those two things don't always go together.
Well, how did you get published? How did you get that first break?
Well, as I said, the first book was a young adult fantasy. Yeah. I mean, I did a lot of research, and I was on these online groups and writing communities, and there were a lot of discussion boards, and people would talk back and forth. And I got a lot of help from other either aspiring authors or already authors, which is why I like to help people today. They gave me tips about this is what really works, or if you're doing queries, what you have to do to get agents, you have to send out pitches. It's kind of like you're pitching your story, and you learn how to do it because if you get involved in the writing community, there are people who will help with that. It's trial and error too. I wrote some terrible queries and got rejected all over the place, but I figured it out finally.
Victoria, we're going to start to wind things down. I do have another
Okay.
question for Jeffrey. Jeffrey asks, have you ever experienced writer's block, and how do you overcome that?
I haven't experienced writer's block per se, but I have experienced, I guess, sort of exhaustion, where I don't feel like energized about, the writing, and what I have to do. I mean, one of the good things is when you have contracts where there's deadlines, and you just have to do it anyway. And so I sort of learned that, well, I just got to keep writing, even if I don't like what I'm writing, or in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, this isn't any good. Because you can always go back and revise and edit, but you've got to get something down on the page. So it's like, I'm not a person who says you have to write every day, but if you want to achieve something, and one thing I've used with people is that, a lot of books are around 300 pages, 350 pages, whatever. There's some big ones, but, if you wrote 1 page a day, you'd write a book in a year. And I've told people that, and I said, if you're not on deadline, if you're just writing your first book or whatever, if you can write 1 page a day, you can write a book in a year. And so it becomes less daunting just to set those goals.
Good advice.
And that's what I do as much as I can if I'm experiencing ennui or something.
So Victoria, we're coming up on the 60-minute mark, and I always like to ask the author, what is next for Victoria Gilbert? I know we've alluded to a couple of projects in the works. What is next for you?
Well, as I said, I'm writing the 3rd book in the Hunter and Clewe series. And I think it's going to be called A Deadly Clue, but we haven't totally decided on that yet. That will come out in the spring of 2026. This next summer will be the 9th book, which is completed in the Blue Ridge series. And that will come out in July. And then I am writing the 10th book, which will come out the following summer. And beyond that, I'm not sure. With contracts, out so many years, but you don't always know beyond that, because that's another aspect of publishing, is that the publisher has to want more books in that series, or want to keep going. And so you're not guaranteed anything, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Sure.
I'm lucky that I've had longer series, and I feel gratitude for that.
Yeah. All right. Well, folks, let's give Victoria a big virtual round of applause for a great presentation, a great conversation, easy for me to say. Folks who are watching live, look for an email from me later tonight with a link to this recording, information about some other upcoming virtual programs that might be of interest, as well as a link to Wellesley Books to purchase an autographed copy of Schooled in Murder. So, and also for those watching live, please take 60 seconds and fill out the feedback survey that will pop up on the screen when you exit the Zoom. Victoria, do you have any last words for the audience?
Well, I just would like people to know that if they want to follow me or know what's up, I have a website, victoriagilbertmysteries.com. And everything is there, all my links to all my social media. and a list of books and when they're coming out, and information about all my books and links to buy them or get reviews or whatever. So that's the best way to really know what's up with me and my books.
So folks, I put Victoria's website in the chat, and I'll also include it in the follow-up email. So Victoria, thank you for being so generous with your time and spreading the word about your new book. Best of luck with your 3 upcoming books, including the one you're working on currently. So thank you all for watching. I hope you have a great night. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time. Bye, Victoria.
All right. Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.